When the refinery alarms began screaming over the ash-choked valley of Blackridge Pass, most workers ran for shelter, because when dragons fought above industrial territory, the fallout rarely spared anything below, but Elias Ward did not run. He looked up. Through curtains of smoke and drifting embers, he saw the unmistakable spiral of a wounded skyhunter losing altitude, its massive wings faltering as plasma flared unevenly along its flank. And then he saw something else tumble free from the chaos, a small, burning shape falling far too fast to survive. Elias had spent 15 years repairing fusion engines and stabilizing cracked reactor cores, and he understood catastrophic descent when he saw it, so instead of diving into a bunker like the others, he sprinted toward the outer maintenance ridge where scrap metal and coolant tanks lined the perimeter. The falling shape struck the ground beyond the ridge with a muted, sickening thud rather than an explosion, and when Elias scrambled over twisted piping and half-melted scaffolds, he found not debris but a dragon hatchling no larger than a large hound. Its crimson-gold scales scorched black along one side, one wing bent at a wrong angle, tiny chest heaving in frantic, smoke-laced breaths. Above, the adult dragon's roar echoed once, raw, furious, then distant, as aerial combat carried it beyond sight, and Elias understood in that instant that this hatchling had not been abandoned but lost in battle. Acid from ruptured refinery. Tanks seeped across the ground in shimmering rivulets, threatening to eat through exposed flesh, and without hesitation Elias shrugged off his insulated work jacket and wrapped the hatchling's fragile body, ignoring the searing heat that burned through fabric. The creature snapped weakly at him, more reflex than intent, a flicker of defensive flame sputtering from its jaws, but Elias only muttered, "Easy, little furnace, easy," in the same tone he used when calming unstable engines. Dragging nearly 80 pounds of injured dragon across corrosive gravel was no small feat, yet adrenaline overrode caution, and he hauled the hatchling into Maintenance Hangar 3, sealing the blast doors just as shockwaves rattled the outer walls. Inside the dim industrial space, surrounded by tool racks and suspended engine parts, Elias laid the hatchling on a reinforced steel table usually reserved for dismantled thruster assemblies, and only then did he fully see the extent of the damage. Fractured wing bone protruding slightly beneath scales, deep lacerations along the abdomen, and embedded shards of anti-air flak lodged between protective plating. He should have called corporate security, should have reported a hostile biological presence. But he had seen enough battlefield footage to know what that meant: containment, weaponization, or execution. Instead, he locked the internal comms, pulled out his mechanics toolkit, and began adapting metal clamps into surgical stabilizers. Dragons were not machines, but structure was structure, and he aligned the wing carefully before setting the bone using a splint fashioned from carbon struts. Each time the hatchling whimpered, a low, rattling sound like coals shifting, Elias felt something twist in his chest. Not fear, but responsibility. Hours passed as distant explosions faded into uneasy silence, and by the time refinery supervisors began conducting damage assessments, Elias had removed most of the embedded shrapnel and sealed open wounds with industrial-grade biofoam intended for emergency hull breaches. He expected the hatchling to die anyway. Creatures that powerful were not meant to be patched together in a greasy hangar. But sometime near midnight, as coolant systems hummed softly and sparks flickered from half-repaired engines, the hatchling's breathing steadied. Its eyes, molten amber despite pain, opened and fixed on him with startling clarity. Elias exhaled slowly, unaware that faint lines of light were beginning to trace across his forearm where dragon blood had soaked through his sleeve during treatment. He only noticed when heat pulsed gently beneath his skin, not burning but marking, and when he pulled back the fabric, he saw an intricate sigil forming along his wrist, curving lines like stylized wings wrapped around a central ember-shaped glyph. He stared in disbelief because every child in Blackridge knew the old stories. Those who saved dragonkind in moments of mortal vulnerability sometimes bore the dragon mark, a bond etched not by ink but by shared blood and intent. It was said the mark could grant resilience against flame, heightened perception, even glimpses into draconic emotion, but it also painted its bearer as something more than human in a world that already feared dragons. Elias looked from the glowing sigil to the fragile hatchling watching him, and as if in acknowledgement, the small dragon shifted painfully closer, resting its snout against his marked arm. The warmth intensified, not scorching but harmonizing, And in that silent exchange, amid oil stains and scorched steel, a mechanic who had never sought destiny realized he had stepped irreversibly into it. Outside, sirens signaled approaching patrol craft, and rumors of a fallen dragon spread quickly through refinery channels. But inside Hangar 3, beneath flickering lights and the scent of smoke, a bond older than any corporation had been forged, and Elias Ward, grease-stained and exhausted, bore the dragon mark without yet understanding that the hatchling he had saved was heir to a lineage whose enemies would soon come searching for both of them. By dawn, the refinery sirens had fallen silent, replaced by the low thrum of patrol skimmers sweeping the valley for wreckage, survivors, and anything valuable left behind after the aerial clash, and Elias Ward stood in Hangar 3 staring at the glowing sigil on his forearm as if it might fade with denial. It did not. The dragon mark pulsed softly beneath his skin like a second heartbeat, warm but not painful, its ember-shaped core brightening whenever the hatchling shifted on the steel table. He had wrapped the creature more securely during the night, reinforcing the wing splint and adjusting the biofoam seals where draconic blood, thicker and brighter than any human's, had seeped through. The hatchling was conscious now, though weak, its molten eyes tracking every movement Elias made, not with fear but with a strange, assessing awareness far too intelligent for something so young. When refinery security pinged his console requesting access logs for Hangar 3, Elias rerouted the feed to display archived footage of routine engine repairs, hands moving automatically over controls while his mind raced. Harboring a dragon was treason under corporate law, and bearing a dragon mark was worse. It implied alliance. Rumors would spread fast if anyone saw the sigil, and fear would follow faster. He pulled a mechanic's glove over his marked arm just as heavy boots echoed outside the blast doors. 2 security officers entered, scanning the hangar with handheld sensors calibrated to detect abnormal heat signatures. Elias forced a casual shrug, gesturing toward a disassembled turbine core as distraction. But the hatchling's internal fire sac flickered in response to unfamiliar voices, causing the mark to flare in tandem beneath his glove. The synchronized pulse startled him. Heat surged briefly through his veins, sharpening his hearing, and for an instant he could sense the hatchling's agitation as if it were his own. Instinctively, he stepped closer to the steel table, lowering his voice in a calming murmur. Astonishingly, the hatchling quieted, flame dimming to embers, and the heat spike on security scanners dropped below alert thresholds. The officers grumbled about false readings from damaged equipment and eventually withdrew, leaving Elias alone again with the weight of what had just happened. He flexed his marked hand slowly, realizing the bond was not symbolic, it was functional. When the hatchling felt threatened, he felt it. When he steadied himself, the creature responded. The implications were staggering. Before he could process further, a shadow darkened the hangar skylight, vast and unmistakable. Elias looked up just as reinforced glass trembled under the downdraft of massive wings. The adult dragon from the night battle had returned. Panic surged through refinery channels, emergency turrets activating along perimeter walls, but the dragon did not attack. It landed heavily beyond the hangar doors. Scales scarred and one horn cracked, smoke curling from its nostrils in restrained fury. Elias felt the hatchling's sudden rush of emotion, recognition, longing, fear, and the mark burned brighter, no longer subtle but radiant beneath his glove. The blast doors groaned as something immense pressed against them, and Elias made a decision that defied every survival instinct he possessed. He triggered the manual override and opened the hangar. Security alarms wailed instantly, automated defense systems locking onto the dragon's heat signature, but Elias stepped forward into the open threshold, raising his marked arm high. The glow intensified, casting amber light across oil-stained concrete, and for a suspended second the entire refinery seemed to hold its breath. The adult dragon lowered its massive head, eyes blazing. Not with immediate aggression but with searing scrutiny. Elias felt the hatchling limp from the table behind him, dragging its splinted wing toward the doorway. The bond between them surged, emotion flooding through the mark. Relief so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. When the hatchling reached the threshold and gave a weak, rasping chirp, the adult dragon's roar shattered the air, not in rage but in something rawer. It extended one colossal talon cautiously, stopping short of Elias, and in that fragile distance hung the choice between bloodshed and understanding. Refinery turrets powered to lethal capacity, Awaiting a single hostile movement, Elias kept his arm raised, meeting the dragon's blazing gaze despite terror clawing at his ribs. "It's alive," he said hoarsely, though he knew the dragon could sense it already. The mark pulsed in a steady rhythm, echoing the hatchling's heartbeat. Slowly, agonizingly, the adult dragon lowered its head until its breath washed over Elias in scorching waves. Instead of incineration, there was inspection. The dragon's gaze shifted to the glowing sigil on Elias's arm, and something ancient flickered behind those molten eyes. Recognition of a covenant older than any refinery. The turrets tracked the movement, red targeting beams crawling over scale and wing membrane, but the dragon did not strike. It exhaled a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through steel and bone alike. Elias felt it through the mark not as threat but as acknowledgement. Then, with deliberate care, the dragon pressed its forehead lightly against the hangar floor in front of him, a gesture of guarded respect. Gasps echoed from refinery personnel watching through surveillance feeds. The deadliest predator in the region had bowed its head to a human mechanic. Elias did not understand the full meaning, but he understood enough. The hatchling was no ordinary stray. It belonged to a lineage powerful enough that its survival mattered beyond one battle. As the adult dragon lifted its head again, distant aircraft roared into the valley, military insignias glinting in morning light. Reinforcements had arrived, and unlike refinery security, they would not hesitate to fire. Elias felt the hatchling's fear spike through the mark, and without waiting for orders or permission, he stepped fully out of the hangar to stand between the approaching gunships and the dragon family behind him. Grease-stained boots planted on scorched concrete, a glowing sigil blazing on his arm, unaware that by choosing this side in full view of armed forces, he had just declared himself part of a conflict far larger than a single rescue, and that the dragon mark was about to test whether he was worthy of the bond it had etched into his skin. The gunships swept low over Blackridge Pass, rotors thundering against the scorched valley walls, missile ports opening with mechanical precision as targeting systems locked onto the adult dragon's immense heat signature, and Elias Ward stood alone on the refinery platform with his marked arm raised, fully aware that to the incoming pilots he looked less like a mediator and more like a traitor shielding a hostile apex predator. The dragon mark burned fiercely now, its ember core blazing bright, enough to be seen even in daylight, and through it Elias felt the hatchling's terror spike like a live current while the adult dragon behind him coiled protectively, wings partially unfurled yet restrained, torn between defending its offspring and honoring the fragile trust just formed. Refinery loudspeakers crackled with evacuation orders, supervisors screaming for Elias to clear the blast zone, but he did not move. Instead, he focused on the pulse beneath his skin, steadying his breathing the way he did when stabilizing an overheating reactor, and as his heartbeat slowed, he sensed the hatchling calm fractionally in response, the emotional feedback loop between them strengthening into something deliberate rather than accidental. The lead gunship's targeting laser traced a crimson line across the adult dragon's chest, and Elias stepped directly into its path, raising both arms now. "Stand down," he shouted into the open comm frequency, his voice carried by refinery transmitters into cockpit headsets. Warnings blared from pilots about hostile interference, but before missiles could launch, something extraordinary happened. The dragon mark flared outward in a radiant wave of amber light, expanding from Elias's forearm across his chest in branching sigils that resembled outstretched wings. The air around him shimmered with heat distortion not destructive but shielding, and when the adult dragon instinctively exhaled a defensive plume of flame, the fire curved, bending around Elias rather than consuming him. Gasps echoed over open comm channels. Thermal readings spiked yet registered Elias at safe biological thresholds, as though the flame recognized him. Through the bond he felt the adult dragon's realization. He was no mere bystander but bearer of an ancient pact known among dragonkind as the Emberbound, mortals marked by draconic blood to serve as bridge rather than servant. Legends whispered that such bonds arose only when a dragon's lineage owed life debt under conditions of true sacrifice. The hatchling, trembling at the hangar threshold, chirped again, and Elias felt a sudden rush of images flood his mind. Flashes of mountain Ares carved into obsidian peaks, of council fires burning beneath starlit skies, of a sigil identical to his etched into ancient stone. The hatchling was heir to the Embercrest brood, a lineage tasked with guarding geothermal veins beneath the valley long before human refineries tapped them. The recent aerial battle had not been random aggression but a defensive strike against corporate excavation that threatened to destabilize a magma chamber sacred to dragonkind. Elias staggered under the weight of shared memory but did not lower his arms. "You're firing on Guardians," he transmitted hoarsely, relaying the images to Refinery Command through neural feedback spikes measured by their sensors. Analysts scrambled to verify seismic data and discovered, to their alarm, that drilling coordinates indeed intersected. Volatile magma flows. If destabilized, the eruption would annihilate both refinery and nearby settlements. The adult dragon had been fighting not for conquest but prevention. Tension rippled through military command as new data collided with old assumptions. One missile launched prematurely from a jittery wingman, streaking toward the dragon in a white-hot trail, and in that split second Elias did not think. He reacted. The mark surged, heat coursing through his veins like liquid fire yet not burning, and he thrust his marked arm forward. A translucent barrier of shimmering flame erupted outward, intercepting the missile midair. The explosion blossomed harmlessly above the platform, scattering sparks like a false sunrise. Shock waves rattled gunships, forcing them to pull back. Silence followed, heavy and stunned. Elias collapsed to one knee, breath ragged, the mark dimming but still glowing faintly. He felt exhaustion crash over him, yet beneath it pulsed fierce certainty. The bond had not been symbolic protection. It had awakened latent draconic energy capable of channeling and redirecting flame. The adult dragon stepped forward then, placing one colossal claw carefully beside Elias without touching him, a silent statement that the human under its wing was under its protection. Refinery Command finally ordered a ceasefire, citing geological risk pending review. Gunships circled at distance rather than engaging. Emergency geologists confirmed destabilization probabilities, rising if drilling continued. In that fragile lull, Elias pushed himself upright and turned to face both sides. Human machinery bristling with weapons on one horizon, dragon fire smoldering on the other, and understood that standing between them was no longer temporary. The dragon mark had chosen him not simply to save a hatchling but to expose a truth buried beneath profit and pride. As medics rushed toward him and engineers debated shutdown protocols, the hatchling limped forward and pressed against his leg once more, and through the bond he felt not fear now but fierce pride. Overhead, the adult dragon unfurled its wings fully, not in threat but in declaration, casting a vast shadow that covered Elias like a mantle. Word of the missile interception and the human who bent dragonfire spread rapidly across communication networks, igniting controversy, awe and anger in equal measure. Some called him reckless, others traitor, others miracle. But as seismic drills powered down and emergency negotiations were hastily convened between refinery officials and dragon emissaries, one truth became undeniable. The mechanic who had once repaired engines in obscurity now stood at the fulcrum of a centuries-old conflict, bearing a mark that proved coexistence was not myth but mandate. And the next decision he made would determine whether Blackridge Pass became a battlefield remembered for blood, or the birthplace of an unprecedented alliance between flame and steel. Negotiations began not in marble halls or corporate towers but on the scorched platform of Blackridge Pass, where molten rock still glowed faintly in fissures beneath refinery foundations and the scent of burned fuel lingered in the wind, and Elias Ward stood between two worlds with the dragon mark etched bright across his skin. The drilling rigs had been powered down under emergency order, seismic projections displayed on hovering screens for both human engineers and dragon emissaries to witness, and the data was irrefutable. Continued extraction would fracture the magma chamber that the Embercrest brood had guarded for centuries, unleashing an eruption capable of burying refinery, settlements, and area alike beneath rivers of fire. Refinery executives, pale and furious, demanded compensation for halted operations, while the adult dragon, now identified formally as Kareth of Embercrest, towered at the valley's edge with wings partially unfurled, not as threat but as reminder of consequence. Elias felt every surge of tension through the mark like distant thunder beneath his ribs, the hatchling pressed against his leg as living proof of what had already been risked. When tempers flared and accusations of sabotage and trespass began to spiral, Elias stepped forward, lifting his marked arm so that its amber glow reflected across steel hulls and scaled armor alike. "This isn't about territory," he said. Voice amplified through refinery speakers and carried on open comm channels. It's about survival for all of us. He relayed again the images burned into his mind by the bond. Ancestral dragonfires regulating geothermal pressure, controlled flame channels venting excess heat long before humans arrived. A balance maintained not by conquest but stewardship. The engineers cross-referenced ancient geological anomalies and realized that the valley's relative stability over centuries could not be explained by natural processes alone. Dragons had been stabilizing it. Silence followed that revelation, heavy and transformative. Kareth lowered his massive head, and through the mark Elias sensed guarded respect as well as grief, for hatchlings lost in clashes born of misunderstanding. Refinery Command reluctantly proposed relocation of primary drilling operations to a less volatile sector, yet moving infrastructure would take months and cost billions. Shareholders would not accept losses without alternative. Elias, still a mechanic at heart, suggested collaboration instead of retreat. If dragons could regulate geothermal vents with precision flame, and humans could engineer containment turbines to harness excess pressure safely, the valley could become a shared energy source rather than a contested one. The idea rippled outward, absurd at first glance, yet practical upon examination. Engineers began sketching rapid prototypes of magma-stabilizing conduits powered by controlled draconic flame bursts, with dragons maintaining equilibrium while turbines converted excess heat into sustainable power. It would require trust on both sides unprecedented in scale. Kareth consulted silently with other dragons who had arrived along the ridge, and after tense deliberation, agreed to a trial under one condition. The Embercrest hatchling, still healing beside Elias, would remain under his protection as Emberbound Guardian, symbol of the pact forged in fire and blood. Elias accepted without hesitation, aware that this choice permanently altered the trajectory of his life. Over the following weeks, refinery workers and dragons labored side by side in wary coordination. Elias found himself mediating technical misunderstandings and instinctual clashes, the mark often warming when emotions spiked, helping him sense and defuse tension before it erupted. The hatchling, named Pyra by mutual agreement, grew stronger daily, wing mending cleanly under Elias's improvised splints replaced by reinforced bioalloy braces. The first ignition test of the joint system drew observers from across the region. Dragons directed controlled streams of flame into newly constructed vent arrays while turbines hummed to life, converting volatile magma pressure into stable energy output. Seismic monitors registered unprecedented stability. The valley did not tremble, it harmonized. When the power grid lit surrounding settlements without a single plume of uncontrolled smoke, cheers rose from human workers while dragons answered with resonant skyward roars that echoed not as threat but triumph. News networks broadcast the transformation of Blackridge Pass from war zone to collaborative marvel, and debates across distant cities shifted from fear of dragons to fascination with partnership. Still, opposition lingered, hardliners within corporate and draconic factions alike wary of dependency. But the visible success of shared infrastructure weakened their arguments. One evening, as the sun dipped behind jagged peaks and turbines glowed with steady warmth, Elias stood atop the main platform with Pyra perched proudly on his shoulder brace, her once fractured wing now flexing strong against twilight winds. Kareth landed nearby, massive presence softened by quiet acknowledgement, and in a gesture witnessed by both species, the great dragon extended a talon not in dominance but in oath. Elias placed his marked hand against it, the sigil flaring briefly before settling into a steady glow. Through the bond flowed not just emotion but shared purpose. The valley would be protected, energy would be balanced, and neither flame nor steel would rise in ignorance again. The dragon mark no longer burned as a warning. It shone as covenant. And as night settled over Blackridge Pass, illuminated by clean geothermal light rather than destructive fire, the mechanic who once mended engines realized he now helped mend something far greater. The fracture between species. The story of the human mechanic who saved a dragon hatchling and bore the dragon mark spread beyond the valley, becoming legend not because he wielded power, but because he chose responsibility when fear would have been easier. And in the quiet hum of turbines synchronized with distant dragonfire, a new chapter of shared history began. One forged not in conquest, but in courage, trust, and the enduring heat of a promise kept.